I can imagine that the last few weeks have probably been absolutely crazy for you in terms of people reaching out, looking for help and some guidance. How has the transition been throughout the pandemic in terms of how people are reaching out and what they're reaching out about?
Well, we really have seen a progression, and it really tends to vary week by week. So in the beginning, there was a huge amount of uncertainty. So we really didn't have a huge amount of information. So there was a lot of conjecture as to how bad this might be, which in turn had a significant impact of anxiety on the bulk of the population. We just really had no firm grasp of, and not that we necessarily have a lot more now, but we certainly have more than we had in the beginning of individuals dealing with worry, concern, even before we knew whether we were going to have financial support. How much time we would be away from work. There was just a significant amount of uncertainty. But what I did find, for example, in my own practice, is that initially numbers went down. People were kind of okay with the process, at least at that point.
That's really interesting that that would be the case, that there would almost be a dip. It was almost like a lull that some people sort of saw it as March break being extended.
Yeah.
But now, what's sort of going on now in terms of the focus for a lot of your clients?
Now it's frustration, anger. Anger is showing up quite regularly. I think everybody is seeing it certainly online. A lot of varying opinions. When we as a population, as we tend to get bored with things, this is when we see more of the conspiracy type thought, more people delving into alternative sources, let's say, of information or news, and the reality of finances starting to get thinner and thinner. Anger is something I'm seeing a fair bit of, and it doesn't necessarily always show up as a person fuming angry. Anger has many ways of showing up. So anger can show up as despondency, people not wanting to really engage in anything anymore. It can show up in varying ways: relationship challenges, irritation with spending more and more time with people that we don't necessarily normally spend that amount of time with, and anger at something that we have so little control over. This is a common human response to when we don't have control. Anger is a go-to emotion. But it's not necessarily the anger of an argument type anger. It's an anger at life, which actually can also segue into forms of depression. Depression and anger are good friends, and anxiety and anger are good friends, but more so in the depressive realm. Anger and depression are good friends, for lack of better wording.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I wanted to touch base on was you mentioned about looking for alternative sources for information. And what role has social media played in terms of what you're seeing as people look for different information? Often we seek out information that we like or will confirm what we think. How do you encourage your clients to manage their access to social media during a time like this?
Definitely limitation, because it's the challenge with social media is you don't control the narrative. So we can't really control, in particular with certain forms of social media, and I'm going to leave names out, but in some forms of social media, you have more control over your newsfeed. In other forms of social media, you don't. So what I'm really suggesting to many of my clients right now is the forms of media that they don't have a lot of control over. So they can't tailor their news feed as much as perhaps other channels to really keep this at a limit, because I'm as a therapist, I'm starting to see people who normally would be friends with someone who maybe yesterday posted something that they don't agree with. They're starting to see these relationships degrade that normally, as Canadians, we're okay with having different political opinions. We're generally okay with these things, but now, because of not being able to interact in the way that we normally interact, we're just seeing this snippet, or we're seeing an individual just sharing one particular thing, that now that's clouding how we see them as a person. So I'm definitely suggesting that people limit their intake or highly try to tailor it. So we all have the opportunity to tailoring at least some of these forms of social media to be positive. You can eliminate a lot of the negativity. We just have to be vigilant in doing it. There's a few channels, though, where that's not the case. And I do have to say to some of these people, do your absolute best to shut that channel down, at least until some normalcy starts coming back in, where that feed might not be quite so negative or anxious, because depending on the feed that they're getting, some things may feed more anger, some things may feed more anxiety. And then on a positive end, we can be quite directive in feeding ourselves positivity. It's harder to find right now, but it is still out there.
One of the things that I personally have noticed with friends and family is the rise in anxiety at different phases throughout.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, it seemed there was the anxiety of the unknown and the what if. And now it seems like it's almost changing to when things are going to happen. And is it a natural thing for us to be anxious about the next step? And how do we manage that in a situation where we really have very limited control?
Yeah, it's a lot of it is exercising patience. So realizing cognitively that we all have an impatient side of our mind, and culturally we don't wait for much. We are now in a position where we have to wait. We have to be patient, and I'm really encouraging the bulk of my clients to respect their own process in this. So if something truly does feel highly uncomfortable for them, to be compassionate towards themselves regarding that form of anxiety that they may have. So if, for example, for one person, the grocery store could be a highly anxious thing right now, then they get into a debate of whether they should or shouldn't be anxious. And if they are, then being compassionate towards themselves that they are uncomfortable with this. Acknowledgement is the key. Acknowledging our emotions, not trying to stuff our emotions down or get into a lot of mental debate as to whether our emotions are right or wrong. Our emotions just simply are what they are. And the more that we're accepting of that, the less we're going to see these sort of peaks of anxiety or peaks of anger. And we're in a position now where because we are beginning to transition back into certain things, there's also going to be very significant variance on opinions regarding that. Because for many of us that have been in isolation for quite a bit of time, we're actually now getting used to isolation. We may not necessarily like it, but we are getting used to it. And then when society is now saying, well, actually now you now need to maybe move back into being less comfortable regarding that, there's going to be varying opinions, and there's also going to be varying emotions around that. Uh, for many of the significantly elderly clients that I work with here and there, they experienced this during the Depression. And some of these things continued where they hoarded their money or they hoarded their possessions because they had gone through such a long period of that not being a guarantee.
And since you brought that up, it links really well to my next question. When a lot of us right now are managing elderly parents, some we have contact with and some we don't have direct contact with. What are some of the strategies that both seniors and their children can use right now to keep those connections open and hopefully stay united during this time?
Well, we have to work with the tools that we have available. So it really does tend to be a case by case situation. But keeping, many of the elderly are better with phone communication than trying to force perhaps a 70 or 80-year-old to get on Zoom or to get on Skype. So we do want to work with the tools that they're comfortable with. So a phone call, even though for us, because we're so used to, video communication and things like that, that may feel comfortable for you or I, but it might not feel as comfortable for somebody who's more elderly. So we want to work with the forms of communication that they're comfortable with, and then regularity. Now, regularity I find is actually more important than length. So if you're regularly in communication with an older family member, but that call is only 5 or 10 minutes long, that may be much more beneficial than an occasional 45-minute call, that is on Sunday afternoon. So frequency is the key when possible, and I'm well aware that this does vary, that depending if it's a nursing home situation or something like that, the options for regular communication might be less. But frequency, we are social animals. Even introverts are social animals. We just may want it, when I say we, because I'm an introvert, even though it might not always seem that way. We work better with a shorter length of communication, but frequent, where a more social individual might want that hour-long conversation if possible.
And on the other end of the spectrum, we've got so many parents right now helping young children, early teens, and even young adults working through an educational process that up until 2 months ago was completely foreign to them. How are, what you've seen so far, how are parents managing that work-life school balance right now?
I would say what I see is a little skewed because I'm working with the parents that aren't doing very well with it. So if they are doing well with it, they're not generally calling someone like me. So I do have to speak to a bit of bias in that one. On the negative spectrum, the primary thing that I'm seeing is parents expecting too much of themselves. They're expecting to complete the entire, if they're receiving, let's say, daily lesson plans or daily content from teachers, they're expecting themselves to be able to do all of it, perhaps on a daily basis, which is causing a lot of frustration for them. And then in turn, it can also project onto the children. So the children then feel like they're either too far behind or that the whole process begins to break down. So in being in regular communication with a few teachers currently, the big thing that parents need to understand is that the teachers really do understand that there's going to be significant variance in level of compliance, level of aptitude, level of success. So it comes back to that compassion piece is there are no teachers out there that are expecting perfection on this. There are no teachers out there that are expecting it to be even necessarily highly successful. What we're trying to do is just keep our children's brains active. We're trying to keep our children's brains learning to a degree. But it's expectation that gets in the way. It's that when a parent feels like they have to get either full completion on every one of these lesson plans, or that they're supposed to understand grade 11 math. Not everybody does, and if you're incapable of doing that, it's okay. Um, it's challenging. We all want to be proficient as parents, and in turn, this new role that we kind of have, but we're not necessarily trained for it, and we weren't all good in all the subjects that our children are taking. So, if it's a grade 1 level, well, that generally we're all going to be able to kind of pull that off. But in particular for students that are in the upper grades, even middle school content can be challenging because it's changed. So what we might have learned in grade 7 and 8 isn't necessarily what our kids are learning in grade 7 and 8. And if that's totally new content for us as parents, we're not necessarily going to do a very good job of teaching it. Mm-hmm. So it comes back to that. I don't want to sound too repetitive, but the compassion is we just have to be compassionate with ourselves about what our capacity is. When we are, and we realize, well, completion on all of this or success on all of this isn't what anybody is expecting. It's not what the school board is expecting. It's not what our teachers are expecting. Then we do the best we can with the tools we have available and realize that the gaps will get filled. From my understanding, the teachers are already somewhat discussing how they're going to fill gaps that they know are going to exist either in the next semester or in the next grade. So they're aware. They're not expecting us to that all these children are going to come back as though they hadn't missed school.
It's, as a parent of a grade 7, it's been a wonderful opportunity learning algebraic equations again from grade 7. With how then can parents also find the balance of reward with completion and success? Because right now a lot of parents, some that I'm talking to, like you said, it's going from one thing to the next. How can we convince those parents that it's okay to pause and celebrate success and even reward in terms of not necessarily financial, but also emotional reward and accessing what we have available to us?
Well, I think, that can come in various forms. It can come just in verbal, parents verbally affirming to themselves that they're doing the best they can, affirming to their children that the children also are doing the best that they can. You mentioned very well that the learning environment itself isn't necessarily overly conducive. So the kids that even are learning on some level are also doing it in a very foreign kind of environment. And then I encourage, when safe, that taking breaks, doing something like you've done a math component, let's say, and then moving to baking cookies, and bake the cookies that your kid likes, if that, or something to that effect, where as a group we're celebrating success, and being very, very verbal with plenty of affirmation, that we respect our children, that we respect their process, and really trying to manage emotions through it. Generally, when we lower our expectations, not lowering our expectations to a nothing, but lowering our expectations of what's expected in all of this, then the pressure comes off everybody. And we all learn better with less pressure. So if that is that we're only going to get 25% of the curriculum handled that we've been given, Well, that isn't necessarily the end of the world, and the gaps will get filled. That's the beautiful thing of what we are as learners is that under under whatever circumstance we will learn according to what's necessary, and we'll fill the gaps. We'll survive. Gosh, I'm a history buff, and several times through our history, there's been wars, there's been famines, there's been all sorts of things that arrested our ability to learn or to progress. And then when the gates open up again, we fill those gaps, and we learn how to adapt. That's our strength is adaptability. Doesn't mean we like it, but we do it.
And changing gears now to the parents or adults that are working, we have two kind of groups right now. Those that are still laid off and for the inevitable future are going to be laid off or out of work completely. But also we've got this other group now that are gearing up for coming back to work in a new environment. So dealing with the ones that are gearing up for work, how do they mentally prepare themselves to go back into the workforce in this new normal?
Well, a lot of it is working mindful type exercises, realizing that there really isn't. We can't prepare for what we don't know. So understanding that it's going to be a learning curve for everybody. Anxiety roots itself in what we call future projection. So it starts to worry about things that aren't occurring yet. And we have to bring ourselves very much back into the present whenever possible in that situation and say, okay, if work restarts, let's say this Monday, then I'll deal with Monday when it's Monday. Now, I know theory and practice. I realize that's challenging. The key is also maintaining a good composure through the body. So breath work, meditative type exercises. Breath work can be very short. It can be just taking 3 to 5 breaths. Just realizing that when we get anxious, that transfers into our body. And if we regulate our breathing, we eat and exercise when possible, and we do our maintenance, and we keep a certain amount of distraction in. That's the key, because we can't prepare for something that we don't yet know. So everybody's work environment is going to be slightly different in what's necessary for their work. So that will happen once they're there. And I realize that's challenging because our mind does like to project and tries to be prepared. But the main thing is like, well, the best preparation I have is remaining calm. And how do I remain calm? Well, drink water, exercise, breathe, stay positive. So go back to our social media conversation, stay out of what's causing worry, stay out of what's causing anxiety. And that the most empowered we can be is when we're calm. So that is the thing that I'm emphasizing with many individuals right now is calm. Maintain calm. And that's almost the mantra of remain calm and do what's necessary to create calm. Mm-hmm. And that's breathing, exercise, healthy diet, the main components of health and wellness.
Mm-hmm. And with the other group that are looking at a long-term layoff or back to work, what's our best advice to those individuals that don't see, an end in sight right now?
Well, there's a mantra that's very useful in this one is, this too shall pass, which is there are going to be industries that are going to see quite a long haul. And the most important thing to remind our mind of is that it will end. We will not be in this position forever. And realizing that there's an impatient side to all of our minds that wants the end now. But the end is coming. And then I'm a firm believer in filling that time. So if somebody knows they're in an industry that's got another couple months, let's say, to go, or at least several weeks, is what are they doing for their mental health? What are they doing for their physical health? What are they doing for their spiritual health? So looking at those three components almost on a daily basis, because this is how we stay distracted. This is how we stay distracted from watching paint dry, the boredom. So taking up hobbies, there's a lot of free learning out there right now. Universities, colleges, libraries that are offering a lot of free content. And so splicing our day, where if we know we're not going back to work for another month or 2 months or maybe more, okay, well, I can learn something during that time. We have to stay like we feel like we have a certain amount of control, and we can control learning something. We can control our diet. We can control to a certain degree, depending on location, exercise and management of that, and then realizing it will end. Every industry will eventually return. There'll be a few that aren't necessarily as useful as they might have been in the past. There's going to be some evolution, but it's all going to come back. It just is at what point, and how do we fill the gap? Because we have to stay distracted. We have to stay busy.